Hello, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. Welcome back to the Mind of the Meek, where today I'll be sharing my thoughts on yet another interesting topic about response, that our response makes the difference. But before I get into it, remember, if you're watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing, liking the content if you found any value in it, and also leaving your thoughts below in the comment section so I can read through them and understand if we think alike, because this is the Mind of the Meek. It's a great minds hub. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I'd like to start with a scripture, in particular James chapter 1 verses 14 through 16, and it reads, "But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." But the question that came to my mind is, when desire has developed, how did it become sin? Did it just happen arbitrarily or randomly? And when sin is full grown, did it merely produce death all by course of nature without our involvement? There are two words that can be used to better understand the text in this context, and they are consent and continuity. Now, consent is what intersects between desire and sin, because one has to give consent to temptation for it to result into sin. And continuity is what intersects between sin and death, because sin, being full grown, implies a continuous process or development over a period of time, meaning that people who decide to remain to practice sinful habits are the ones who will be subjects of eternal destruction. When I read the key text, James chapter 1 verses 14 through 16, another question came to mind. How does temptation become a sin, practically speaking? Well, consent is a response. Consent is what intersects between temptation and sin. Sin is consent to temptation. When Adam sinned not because of the woman, but because of his response to the woman's proposal. When Eve offered the fruit, that was a temptation component. When he took the fruit and ate it, that was the response component. Adam sinned because he gave consent to temptation. The woman didn't make him sin. His response did. In Proverbs chapter 1 verse 10 it says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent." In the text we can clearly see that enticement is the temptation component. Do not give consent is the response component. Whenever there's an instruction that starts with do not, it's likely an appeal to withdraw consent. Now, on to the next. Sin cannot have power over you unless you give it permission to do so. And you give it permission by making yourself available to temptation. In Romans chapter 6 verse 12, it says, "Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, so that you obey its evil desires." Once again, there's an appeal to withdraw consent. Interestingly, for sin to reign or to have power over someone, they have to give consent or allow it. On the contrary, if one doesn't give consent or allow sin or the proclivities to sin to overpower them, then it wouldn't. Why? Because power is permissive. You allow whatever or whoever to control your decisions. Sin cannot have power over you unless you give it permission to do so. And you give it permission by making yourself available to temptation. Hence why there's an appeal to withdraw consent from temptation so that it doesn't lead you to making choices that result in shortcoming. Let's also consider what 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10 says. "For the love of money is the root of all evil." Notice it's not money that's evil, but rather the love of it, or in other words, greed, which is a response to having money that leads to all kinds of evil. Because greedy people will stop at nothing to accrue wealth, even at the expense of other people's suffering and even death. Also, let's consider 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 1 through 4. And in that account, King Solomon's wives influenced his decisions that led him away from devoting himself to God. Well, how did that happen? How did the woman contrive to do that to a man who had such power? Well, because they didn't do it without the help of Solomon himself. He was the king of the nation of Israel who had significant power, even over women, than they had over him. The reason why they managed to have the power to control his decisions to the degree where it weakened his devotion to God resulted from him giving them the permission to do so. And also a side note, this is why, for example, when I hear men would say they have to be careful of women because women will make them do the wrong things, I wouldn't completely agree. I would agree to the extent that men should exercise discernment to know when they're dealing with imprudent women that they should avoid being with. However, to the other extent, I wouldn't agree because I would argue that men should be more concerned about their response to women than of women themselves. Because it's one thing for women to tempt you, it doesn't become a sin unless you give consent. You cannot control their behavior, but you can control yours by withdrawing consent. So that's where I'll conclude for today, guys. I hope what I've said you found it to be valuable. And until next time, I hope that you'll join in the next episode on the Mind of the Meek. Until then, peace.